Great, thank you. Good morning and welcome to the second annual conference of the Center for Criminological Research at the University of Alberta. My name is Brian Hookney. I'm here in my capacity as chair of the Department of Sociology. This year's theme is police and policing, and given the events in this country and around the world, it's both timely and relevant to our contemporary times. It's important to start in a good way by acknowledging that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, which include the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Métis, the Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. Land acknowledgements are simply a starting place to change how the land is seen and talked about and acknowledge its longer history. It's also, and perhaps more importantly, a reminder of the historical and ongoing injustices perpetrated against Indigenous communities. The Center for Criminological Research was established in 2020 and every year plays host to a number of exciting and leading-edge events. A quick glance at the website reveals what a dynamic and engaging place it is, if I do say so myself. When you have some time, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel. There, you'll find past talks from our speaker series and more information about the faculty members. And then poke around our website where you're going to learn about all the fantastic work being done through the center and the incredible projects our faculty are working on. The center is committed to two things. First, building on our academic excellence by supporting research and knowledge that pushes the boundaries of criminology. And second, engaging in partnered and community-inspired research projects that provide critical understanding of criminal justice work. Over the next 2 days, you will see these twin goals reflected in the 8 panels. It is truly an international affair, and I'm excited to be here. Our speakers are joining us from around the world, from such places as France, Sweden, Australia, and the Netherlands. With this in mind, the organizers have put a time conversion chart, which is really handy for those of us who struggle with this, on the conference website to help us all navigate the different time zones. I am truly excited to hear all of the talks from some of the world's leading criminological thinkers on police and policing, and I'm sure we'll all be inspired by what we learn over the next couple of days. But before I pass the floor over to Sandra, I just want to acknowledge the hard work and dedication that it took to put on this year's events. Many thanks to the conference organizers, Jeff Brassard and Sandra Becerrius. And I also want to acknowledge the graduate students who will be stick handling the Q&A over the next 2 days. So that's Ashley Cole, Celine Beaulieu, and L'Oreal Griffin. The organizers have put together a sensational lineup of speakers, and my sincere hope is that you thoroughly enjoy and engage with the ideas presented over the next 2 days. Thank you, and over to Sandra.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you so much for your support for the center over the past few months as a chair. As the director and on behalf of the Center for Criminological Research, I want to welcome all of our speakers and, of course, our audience on YouTube from all over the world. We're extremely excited to have you with us and are looking forward to the discussions for the next 2 days. As Brian has said, we've chosen policing as the theme for this year's conference, obviously a timely topic that lends itself to endless debates and discussions and can be looked at from very different angles. And as the center understands itself as a place that allows for controversial, respectful debates, we've invited a stellar lineup of scholars who approach the topic of policing in various ways when it comes to the types of questions they ask, their methodological approach, theoretical framework, and conceptualization of their data. We're all looking forward to the next 2 days of stimulating conversations and panels. And I know that many of us, me included, prefer in-person conferences and, of course, the possibilities to have coffees and beers. We can't really make up for that. But I hope that you will find these next 2 days to be intellectually stimulating nonetheless. Our first online conference around prisons and punishment was a huge success, and we hope that this year's conference will be equally successful despite of us still not being in the same place, physically speaking. All of our panels will be streamed on YouTube, and you can raise your questions directly on the YouTube channel for the Q&As, which our graduate student assistants then feed to us. We will also leave the videos of the panels on the channel for at least 3 months, though hopefully for longer. So if you miss one, you can catch it at a later time. But of course, we hope that many of you join us live. And we would also love for all of you to tweet about the conference as it's going on using the hashtag policing conference, one word. And I also want to draw attention to the schedule that, as Brian has said, you can find on our website, canadiancriminology.com, again, one word. I also would like to thank Jeff and the graduate students who are helping. But I also want to particularly thank all of our community partners, Indigenous partners, and justice stakeholders whose strong support allows us to conduct research that is empirically driven, theoretically informed, and has real life impact in the hopes that our findings can make a small contribution to make our justice system more fair and just. So now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce Dr. Tracy Mears as our keynote speaker today. We are extremely excited to have her with us. Professor Meares is an American legal scholar, the Walton Hamilton Professor of Law, and a founding director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. In 2019, she was also elected as a member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Previous to joining the Yale Law School faculty, she was Max Pam Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Studies in Criminal Justice at the University of Chicago Law School. And at both Chicago and Yale Law School, she was the first African-American woman to be granted tenure. Professor Meares is a nationally and I think internationally recognized expert on policing in urban communities. Her research focuses on understanding how members of the public think about their relationships with legal authorities such as police, prosecutors, and judges. And Professor Meares has worked extensively with the federal government, having served, for example, on the National Academy of Science Committee on Law and Justice and the US Department of Justice Office of Justice Program Service Advisory Board. And in 2014, then President Barack Obama also named her as a member of his task force on 21st century policing. So we are all beyond thrilled that you are here, albeit virtually. We wish it would be in person, and that you have agreed to give the keynote today to open the conference. And with that, I will give it over to you to speak to us to re-examining the state's police power, safety deprivation, and the meaning of citizenship. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is participating. Brian, I could have used that translation table because it was only until yesterday that I realized that I would be speaking to y'all in Alberta at 8 a.m. I hadn't really done that math, so I'm incredibly impressed that you all are up and bright and engaged. And for everyone else, I hope you're having a great day and afternoon. Before I begin my talk on the police power, I want to level set with a couple of points. The first is that when I'm talking about the police power, I'll be focusing on a legal conception as it has been developed in courts in the United States. There are lots of different ways of thinking about the police power, but I just want to make sure that everyone understands that that is the center of how I'm thinking about it. However, doesn't mean that I am not influenced by how other scholars internationally have conceptualized this idea. And in particular, as I advance some of my thinking, I think you will hear reflections of the work of Ian Loader, Neil Walker, and Mulcahy. So I'm definitely influenced more by other scholars who have done this work. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then I think we will have time for questions. At least I hope that we will. So let me begin by saying the police power, at least in the United States, is not well understood. It's ethereal and vast. And importantly, it's central to what state and local governments do, at least in this country. Indeed, it's what they are. Because the term police power includes the word police, many people believe that the police power is the power that an individual police officer has over members of the public to enforce laws. It certainly is that, but the police power is more. It is the power that the state has to enact whatever law that an individual police officer enforces, whether it's a law barring a serious crime or even a low-level prohibition on activities like drinking in public. In the United States, the police power was first mentioned in 1827 by Justice John Marshall in a case called Brown versus Maryland. And that case was actually about the line between the powers that the federal government had to impose taxes on foreign states in contrast to the power of an individual state to do things like, I'm putting this in quotes, enact health laws. While the police power is commonly known as the state's power to protect public health, safety, morals, and general welfare, it's much broader than what that already very broad description covers. In later cases, courts defined the power in such a way to make clear that the police power was the state's power to legislate for the public good. So, in thinking in a really fulsome way about the police power, one must naturally think about the concept of a public good, the traditional definition of which is a good that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And this means that it's a good that anyone can enjoy without diminishing its supply, and no one in a relevant group, let's say a city or a nation, can be excluded even if they can't afford to pay for that good. Now, states typically fund these goods through their power to tax, which also a function of the police power. And this is because the state has a vested interest in making the relevant good available to its citizens and can't rely on the market to provide these goods, as these goods are not necessarily or even ideally profitable. National defense is a classic public good. Most of us, I think, would think it unwise or even silly to refuse national security. And I think many of us would think it's ridiculous to forego things like streetlights, clean water, even sidewalks. I would argue that education is a public good. That's more difficult to argue in this country, I think, than in other places. In 2017, in an essay in the Boston Review, I argued that local policing might also be considered a public good. Policing and local schools are the very reason that in this country we have city governments. If all these things are public goods, it seems like a profoundly bad idea to get rid of them. None of us would seriously think about abolishing national security, right? So what could it mean to say that policing falls into the conceptual category of a public good? I think the first thing to do is to understand the state's role, indeed the state's obligation, to address safety deprivation among its citizens. And in using this term, safety deprivation, I'm following my colleague Veshla Weaver, who in turn I think is following some European scholars, to talk about the idea of violence not as necessarily a category in and of itself, but instead as a symptom of the notion of safety deprivation, a much larger category. I think the second thing to do is to figure out what is the best way for the state to engage in this project. With respect to point one, I will argue that the state has an obligation to address safety deprivation, the most obvious sign of which is rampant violence, and that the state's power, police power, gives it capacity and duty to address that. With respect to point two, I will argue that armed emergency first responders are a very costly way and not necessarily effective way for the state to exercise its police power to address this goal. To make my argument in point one, it's useful to return to the concept of a public good. Now, I think it's difficult to argue today that the policing service as it currently exists is a public good that everyone can enjoy, which prompts a series of questions. How should we think about our public goods when they go bad? How do we know when they're bad? What if they were never truly public goods? The experience that many have with the police service as it exists today suggests that a conclusion that the service is bad is not simply a matter of a service that is incompetent or unreliable. And I don't think the problem is that This good has been subject to private capture, which is a classic problem of public good provision. Typically, those kinds of problems look like corruption, the warping of the provision of a public service through bribery and the like. That's not what we're talking about. Although I think it is fair to say that a major issue with today's police service is its lack of truly public accountability. To the extent that we can consider the police service a public good today, I think we can conclude that it is a bad public good when the public, when considered as a whole, experiences the good of the delivery of the service through concentrating the costs of producing that good on a very small group, such as Black people in this country, and particularly Black men. In such a world, I think it's difficult to say that the good is good or even truly public. And I would say that legislation to create such a good is not an appropriate exercise of the police power. So what could it mean to talk about policing as a public good such that it would actually advance the ideals of the police power as I've described them? I think the first thing to say is that we have to understand the importance of safety and security as a building block of community vitality. And here I'm recognizing that human flourishing is a social enterprise. We interact, we converse, we connect, we learn from one another. That connection is necessary for basic human development, and it's critical for flourishing. Those connections, I think, are predicates for self-governance. The police power was distinguished historically from the power of a beneficent monarch. The state's police power was the power of the citizenry to govern itself, bedrock of democracy. But interaction with one another necessarily exposes us to the risk of private predation from each other. Thus, people are naturally, they have a natural desire to be free from private predation as they pursue endeavors critical to human flourishing. Just like having access to clean water, I think citizens should have access to safety and security. So a key role of government should be to provide such a service to secure this goal to its citizens. But of course, there are many ways the state can and should support this kind of safety, including, by the way, by ensuring access of citizens to clean water. For example, we've just lived through or are living through a COVID pandemic where it is necessary in order to be safe to have access to clean water so that we can wash our hands frequently. If some people don't have access to clean water, maybe some of you have heard of the horrific and tragic situation in the state of Michigan here, it's hard to say that those people are being provided safety. Thinking about various approaches to the state provision of public safety, I think, are the key aspects of thinking about policing as a public good, which I will address later. A major problem, though, is that in the United States and elsewhere, provision of a certain kind of criminal legal apparatus has been the primary, if not sole, response of the state to support citizens' safety and security. This is a problem. And as a theoretical matter, I believe it is inconsistent with the idea of policing as a public good. In the United States, especially in race-class subjugated communities, to use Veshla Weaver and Joe Sauce's terms, relying on the police service as currently conceived as the primary state mechanism to address community safety needs has meant an excess of criminal legal system exposure. Millions of people in this country have been incarcerated or otherwise processed through various kinds of corrections institutions. And if we focus on the subject of interest to this conference, policing, access in this country has been a watchword. We have too much stopping, frisking, engagement by police of civilians, especially with respect to those low-level ordinances I mentioned earlier that have little connection to the real problems people face. There's also too much violence. In the United States, we do not, shockingly, have good or accurate counts of the number of individuals killed by police every year. And the last few years, though, our best estimate of that count has not dipped below 1,000 individuals killed per year. And all of this, the state does in the name of providing safety to its citizens. Defining safety only in terms of the reduction of private predation allows those who control state resources aimed at safety provision to overlook or ignore the incursions on security from government overreach that individuals also want. Now, you'll note, I hope, a few moments ago, I said that safety and security together provide a building block of community vitality. And I intentionally use both terms to preview this distinction between how states provide resources to address private predation on the one hand, and also the key concern that many have when they experience government overreach with respect to the state's typical response to the problem of crime and violence in many neighborhoods. Safety and security can become dangerously bifurcated, and too often in this country end up being balanced against one another. You'll hear police say, of course, we want to do better with respect to, I'll call it the project of government overreach, but there's always a but. We also have to address violence, as if these things don't have anything to do with one another. And of course, that bifurcation brings us back to the problem of provision of a public good by concentrating its costs on a very small group. Private violence is a serious problem and exacts a heavy toll on individuals and members of communities that experience high rates of it. In addition to lost lives or badly compromised ones, we know the communities marked by high rates of violence suffer many downstream costs of that violence. One incredible study by sociologists Pat Sharkey and Andrew Papachristos demonstrates the impact of community violence on children's self-regulatory behavior and cognitive functioning. The study is notable because it was not assessing the impacts when the child herself experienced violence or when she was in a household exposed to violence. Instead, the study focused on violence in a child's neighborhood. Merely living in the neighborhood in which these violent incidents occurred led to cognitive declines in the form of equivalent to, I think, 3 months of a loss of schooling. It's important to note and account for the ways in which the policing service imposes a big toll on individuals, in addition to the violence in community, what we might be calling, in the first instance, the private predation problem. The physical toll of police shootings is obvious, as are, I hope, the experience of being forcibly detained again and again by police. But the cost of how policing is carried out in the United States has much more than a physical toll on bodies, however. Like prevalent police violence, there is a mental and emotional toll that is expressed in mental health challenges and also limitations on school attainment, as my colleagues Philip Atiba-Goff, Jeff Fagan, Tom Tyler, Susan Bandes, and Aaron Carrison have shown in their work. Indeed, some of the violence incidents accounted for by the Papachristos and Sharkey study undoubtedly included police violence against community members that occurred in the neighborhood. And also, there is evidence of the ways in which the greater community experiences mental health challenge and stress by simply being aware of the kinds of police violence that occur among members of one's group. There are other costs too, deep ones, deep troubling ones that go to the heart of how we think about civic engagement and citizenship. This brings me to my second point of charting a path forward for understanding policing as a public good. And that is to recognize that police officers are a particular kind of legal authority. They play a unique role in conveying important information to members of the public about their role and status as citizens. And the relationship that members of the public have with legal authorities is foundational to their understanding of themselves as citizens. Here, I'm obviously leaning on the work of Loader, Mulcahy, Ben Bradford, and others. Critical to thinking through the question of what it means to understand policing as a public good is to think through the question of how is it that police today and over time have told people who they are. Social psychologists tell us that legal authorities convey information to individuals through how they treat people. My research and that of others shows pretty clearly that people care a lot about how they are treated by the state, sometimes much more than the ends that those authorities achieve. That's the idea that people will support whatever efforts the policing service makes to reduce crime, private predation, no matter how they are treated in the process, is simply refuted by research. So what do people care about? Well, first, the social psychology of procedural justice tells us that participation is an important element. People report higher levels of satisfaction in encounters with authorities when they have an opportunity to explain their situation and their perspective on it. Second, people care a great deal about the fairness of decision-making by authorities. They look to indicia of decision-maker neutrality, objectivity, and factuality of decision-making, consistency in decision-making, and transparency. Third, people care a great deal about how they are treated by an organization's leaders. Specifically, people want to be treated with dignity, respect for their rights, with politeness. And fourth, in their interactions with authorities, people want to believe that authorities are acting out of a sense of benevolence toward them. They want to be able to trust their motives. People attempt to discern why authorities are acting the way they do by assessing how they are acting. In their interactions with legal authorities, whether those legal authorities are prosecutors, police, or judges, or just state authorities generally, like public school teachers, people want to believe that the authority that they're dealing with believes that they count. And they make this assessment by looking at how they're treated because we can't read minds. And they care about this. Social psychologists Tom Tyler and Ellen Lynn tell us, because they're always looking for information about their status in society, individually, as well as with respect to their group membership. Treatment by very prominent faces of the state, like police, give people lots of information. So, looking to examples here in the States, Black people in Ferguson, Missouri, perceived a constant message of inferiority and lack of worth when they were the only group in their city to be peppered with charges about how high their grass was, and subsequently subject to outstanding warrants and piles of fees and fines for failing to appear in court for addressing these picayune offenses. The people of Baltimore, where I currently serve on the federal monitoring team for the police consent decree, are aware that they're treated differently by police if they live in West Baltimore, which is predominantly minority and poor, compared to Baltimore's more wealthy inner city neighborhood. And of course, an incident that received international attention, George Floyd's very public lynching, was another moment pregnant with information about how many people in the United States, particularly Black people, understood who they were vis-a-vis the state. Okay, so I hope I have supported my belief that the state has an obligation to address safety deprivation, a act that is distinct in too many race class subjugated spaces that the state itself historically played a key role in creating and maintaining, and still hasn't seriously addressed, as my colleague Elizabeth Hinton's book, America on Fire, demonstrates. I also hope that I have demonstrated the importance of the state's obligation and duty to address this lack as an exercise of the state's police power. The next question then is how to come up with the best way for the state to exercise its police power. And I think the first step in that is to distinguish the police service as we know it from the project of policing Now, you may not have noticed, but as I've been speaking today of policing as a public good, I've tried to be very careful about using the term policing. I don't think I've one time said the police service as a public good. And this might be too fine a point, but what I'm trying to do is to distinguish the police as individuals and the police service as they operate today, and a more theoretical and normative idea of policing as satisfaction of the democratically determined shape of the state's police power. I have a very particular reason for making this distinction, which has to do with the understanding of the idea of safety, where safety in my terms might be just being free from private predation, and security, where security means being free from government overreach, and the importance of talking about those two conjunctively. In this country, the state has approached its obligation to address safety deprivation almost solely through armed general purpose emergency first responders. This is not necessary, and I also think it is wrong empirically and normatively, but that is exactly what too many communities have been given. So what can we do to change the state of affairs? One thing we might do is to look at what these armed emergency first responders do right now and make some immediate changes. I've rehearsed some of those ideas in a short piece written with Tom Tyler and Philip T. Bugoff in NBC Think. And I detailed a few ideas in my own work and that of others in terms of how the policing service as it exists today can better address violence that is too high in many neighborhoods here. So just at a high level, there could be more specialization within police services as it exists right now. And that kind of specialization could actually could entail the fact that some members of the policing service would carry guns and some do not. My understanding is that in the UK, there are armed officers, but very few. They are a small contingent and they come only when called. And particularly, there's no such thing really as the armed general purpose responder. Police departments here in the States could also have folks who are not sworn and therefore not entitled to enforce the law, doing a whole bunch of things that armed first responders do. The problem is that sworn officers are recruited, hired, and trained to do a job that is, in many cases, imaginary, as opposed to the one they are actually called on to do day to day. Now, it is true that policing agencies often defend this position by saying, well, we have to be prepared for every situation, right? But having a huge number of police being deployed to address noise calls, which is true in New Haven. I know this because I am a commissioner on the board of New Haven Police Commissioners, is like sending that person to all of those calls with a gun, is like equipping officers with SUVs and chains on their tires all year round because it snowed once in August. I don't think this is a good idea. Outside the agency, we can make changes. We can send others rather than armed first responders. We can send others who are not necessarily sworn police officers to do the work with police officers. We can detail other public safety agents to do things. We could actually have the fire and EMT department do more work. Anyway, there's a bunch of things that we could do to change the way the police service as it exists now to be better and more safe for members of the public. But reimagining policing as a public good, I think, entails a bigger conversation and therefore is a bigger lift. And what I have in mind here is taking seriously democratic deliberation over the state's power, which is, let me remind you, the capacity of the states to regulate behavior and enforce order within their territory for the betterment of the health, safety, morals, and general welfare of their inhabitants. In the United States, we've ended up in a world in which the policing service as we know it is how the state exercises its police power to address safety deprivation. And it is emphatically not the product of a conscious and deliberative articulation of what Americans believe the connection between the police and the community ought to look like. The police service as it exists today here has instead evolved through a series of informal arrangements for managing immediate problems of disorder, often having to do with management of outgroups by the powerful. This reality is easy to see by looking to history, whether we're talking about how police treated immigrants to major cities during the Progressive Era, or how police treated Black migrants who moved from the South to the North, or even how police treat many members of race-class subjugated communities today. Raisa Kaliabov, the current dean of the University of Virginia, has written a wonderful book about vagrancy that details this progression, showing how police use their discretion without democratic deliberation or clear articulation of the laws that they were going to enforce to manage all kinds of outgroups, not only the groups I just mentioned, but members of the LGBTQ community, people who were choosing not to work when people who had money wanted them to work, and other kinds of political outgroups. Conceptualizing the good of policing that flows from the state's obligations to carry out the police power simply in terms of the police service we have today is just empirically wrong. And many states' response to the COVID pandemic makes my point plainly. Quarantines, vaccinations, mask orders, all sorts of public health regulation occurring just recently in the United States, including today, is a function of the police power, although few people think of that power as having much to do with policing per se. And it's true that in some cases, armed general purpose first responders have played a role in this regulatory apparatus, but they're not the only state actors who are playing a role, and no one seriously thinks that they should be front and center in addressing this public health problem. And they obviously need not be. After 2 years, I think that's pretty obvious. The state's COVID response tells us a lot about what we could do, or at least think about, with respect to the state's response to the problem of violence, which is the argument that many people use to say that we must have the police service as we know it today. For the last decade or so, it's become increasingly common to think of violence as a public health concern. A public health approach entails 4 common steps. You first define and monitor the problem, you identify risk and protective factors, you develop and test prevention strategies, and you then assure widespread adoption. This is basic science that can be carried out with empirical research. The bottom line is that prevention strategies are key. There is nothing about a general purpose armed first responder that is a prevention strategy for violence. There are many models of how to do this work, and none of these models relies principally upon police. Fortunately, in the United States, we have gotten to the point where we think a lot about community violence models and how best to address them. And President Biden recently devoted an increased amount of resources to this idea, supporting it, although in my view, not enough. This approach requires a particular kind of goal, I think, if one is going to take it seriously. And that goal is what it takes to ensure that communities are vital, rather than simply focusing on responding to particularly bad symptoms of lack of community investment. For that is what's happening in neighborhoods that exhibit high rates of violence. These same neighborhoods that exhibit high rates of concentrated violence are also the communities that are weighed down by inadequate housing, failing schools, food insecurity, high rates of maternal death, lead poisoning, and so on, often for generations. And the state's typical response to one of these problems that's inextricably connected to the others, violence, creates concentrated criminal legal exposure in these same communities, which exacerbates the collection of issues I just mentioned. The state's response, the typical response of sending an armed general purpose first responder, is not making these communities better. But the fact that sending the armed general purpose armed armed general purpose emergency responder is not making these communities better is not an argument that the state should absent itself. Again, going back to COVID, these brittle and fragile communities need state resources more than ever. And the necessity of state resources is relevant to a current conversation about abolition and defunding. Here then, I think the conversation about policing as a public good is linked to history. History tells us we need to fully embrace the project of abolition as we consider policing as a public good. And to fully embrace it, one must consider abolition in the context of Reconstruction after the Civil War in this country. To see the importance of the connection, consider the legal abolition of slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment is a legal mechanism that abolished slavery, but the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States didn't magically create a world in which formerly enslaved African Americans suddenly enjoyed the benefits of citizenship that they were denied over 150 years. Reconstruction was the real citizenship project that followed abolition, the legal abolition of slavery, as W.E.B. Du Bois' magisterial Black Reconstruction documents. He documents that during the tragically short Reconstruction period, I remind you, it was ended after about 11 years by white supremacist terrorist action. Formerly enslaved Americans, millions of them, created space for themselves as citizens in this new social order. They reconnected with their families. They created schools, public schools. They established churches. They purchased property. They defended their newfound legal rights in court. They elected officials, magistrates, commissioners, sheriffs, legislatures. They even elected congressmen. They worked out the terms of their citizenship and created mechanisms for state support of these efforts. Their efforts were not a private enterprise. They did not think of themselves as simply creating private organizations to take care of their own in a community. They understood themselves as playing an important role in state creation. A Reconstruction was brought to an end by violent white supremacist paramilitary violence, as I said, violence that the state perpetuated through state-enforced segregation and disenfranchisement through law that was often enforced by local police. And the Supreme Court of the United States in the late 1880s refused to interpret the Constitution, and in particular the 14th Amendment, in defining what equal protection of the laws meant in a way to ensure that the federal government could hold the perpetuators of this violence to account. The rest of the history of the United States with respect to the suppression of citizenship rights of Black people is well known. When activists today argue that the lives of people who have died in these kinds of police encounters, violent ones, that their lives matter, and argue that policing must be abolished, I think they mean that policing, the police service as we know it, must end. And just as during the historical period of chattel slavery, people would have thought it absurd to say, we'll change the law so that people who are enslaved will no longer be enslaved, but basically everything else can remain the same. Different laws for Black and white people, differential access to schools, different accommodations, different salaries, depending on race. It's actually permissible for the state to use convicts to make money. Talking about convict policing here. It's totally okay for police to brutalize this formerly enslaved group, but slavery itself, that's abolished. I think that's absurd. And it's equally absurd, I think, to say that police abolition means no police as we currently understand that role and job, and everything else remains the same. So that means we need to have a particular goal in thinking about how we're going to understand the reconstruction of the state to address the safety deprivation that so many people experience. And to me, that project entails reconstruction. We still need what we needed 150 years ago, an investment in the public goods that all citizens are entitled to. Good schools, adequate healthcare, affordable housing, and so on. And we need a recommitment by the state to give all citizens the resources to determine their fates separate from state interference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This was a fantastic keynote. Thank you. I'm going to let you catch your breath before we before we start with questions. So everyone, you can ask questions on the YouTube channel. I know there will be a little bit of a time lag between. I think you're still speaking on YouTube, so there's a little bit of a delay. But you can ask questions on YouTube directly, and I will then convey the questions here. Or for those of you on the Zoom chat, you can obviously ask questions directly here. And if you're comfortable, you can also turn your cameras on if you wish. I do know that Kevin wanted to have the first question, so I know you said you have a question, so I will turn it over to you to ask the first question, and this way we can also wait for the YouTube questions. Thank you.
I never said I wanted the first question, but I was thinking about things as you were talking. So thank you very much. I actually have several questions, but I guess one of the things I always worry about in sort of thinking about comparing policing in the United States to any other jurisdiction is thinking about the uniqueness of the policing situation in the United States and how this might fit into any image of sort of changing them. In particular, the fact that there are now more guns in the United States than there are human beings. It is the most armed population in the history of the planet. That means almost any call that a police officer goes to, they A, empirically might encounter a gun, and B, psychologically, they're assuming they're going to encounter a gun. So I'm just wondering how this plays into sort of the changing sensibilities, organizational practices, and the gun violence in the United States is, a real thing, I guess.
Yeah, certainly number two is true. Psychologically, they are taught that anytime they show up, there could be a gun. And it is true, as best we can tell, there are more guns. I mean, remember, part of our issue of counting things around, citizens killed by police, it's not adequately counted. The number of guns actually aren't adequately counted, and who has them. My refrigerator is more regulated than guns are in this country. Some things we do know, though, is that typically households that have guns are the ones that are more likely to acquire them. That is, the fact that there are more guns in the United States than people does not mean that they're randomly distributed, and we know that, actually. And so that's one thing I would say, although there is some evidence that shows increasingly more households are acquiring guns. So, just some math there. More guns than people, but less than 50% of households in the United States have a gun. So, let's use that little number. The other thing I guess I would say, Kevin, is that we already have all kinds of state authorities who visit people's homes for other reasons. And they don't say, I need to carry a gun because somebody might have a gun, right? And they very well could. They don't even actually have police escort when they go. So I'm thinking about children and family services, for example. Those folks go to people's homes all the time. They don't have guns. Why do police have to have guns? How different is it to show up for a noise complaint than, showing up to actually accuse someone of not taking care of their children. So, so that's point one. But I do think, as a general matter, your point about addressing guns is, it is a serious challenge. But I guess I would say then that's just maybe the third leg of the stool in terms of thinking about our safety issue. And that is, if one is thinking about government overreach and two is thinking about just the problem of violence that exists, part three is that we really can't think about this without having a serious strategy with respect to guns. And, consistent with that, I actually gave a lecture to about 60 people at Giffords yesterday. Giffords is an organization here in the States that advocates for legislation around gun safety. I could go on and on about the gun thing, but one other little factoid: most people who are killed by guns in the United States commit suicide. They don't kill other people. Most people don't know that.
Hi, thank you so much. I have some other questions. So one is coming in from Dr. Holly Campeau, and she is saying such a common statement among justice-involved persons, even those who have experienced firsthand the failures of policing, is some version of we want the police, but we want them better. Would you place the policing power as public good at the center of this apparent paradox in these communities and resident perceptions? And is it possible to share more about your work in places like Baltimore, where the DOJ has declared policing a public safety threat, to do this very kind of reconstruction project? It's a big question.
I guess I can say a couple of things. Yeah. I actually think the fact that people ask for more police is actually indicative of what I just described. When all you've ever been given to address your safety deprivation problem is armed emergency first responders, and you're experiencing an increase in that particular problem, then is anyone surprised that you ask for more of the thing that you've already been given? If all I've ever eaten is potatoes and I'm hungry, then I'm going to ask for more potatoes, because I don't know that broccolini and apples is actually on the menu. Maybe that's, too flippant of an example, but I think it just makes the point, right? It also makes the second point, which is it highlights the difficulty that people who are arguing for, well, police just need to go away, right? The people who are living in race class subjugated communities, when they face people in their community but sometimes outsiders, will say, this is what we think is good for you. You should have less police. They're like, you don't live here, you have no idea. That's why I focus on the state. The state can do other things, right? And the state must do other things. So that's the answer to the paradox. And one of the things the state can do in light of what Dr. Campeau is saying is, yeah, they can do the thing. Sorry, that's loud here. They can deliver the service that they already deliver better, and I'd say I'd spent the first 10 years of my career doing that work, and I do it right now. But they can also just do a lot of different things. So there are civilian-led offices of violence reduction all around the country in the United States. There are not a lot of them, but there are a lot, but they are around the country. And they focus on community-led violence reduction strategies. You can do that. You can also think about reorganizing your departments of public health, right? This is common. Like, nobody thinks that the best way to deliver healthcare to individuals is for people to rely on the emergency room as their primary form of healthcare. And yet the way we address violence is essentially that. We need the violence reduction equivalent of going to the dentist twice a year. That's what we need. And there are lots of things that we can do that look like that, right? With respect to the last point about, the work in Baltimore, a lot of what I've done, I am the team lead for what's called fair and impartial policing, has been around changing the department's policies, to advance this goal, because it's an administrative unit, right? So the first thing you do is you change their regulations. And then the second thing you do is you train to those regulations. And you do parts 1 and 2 in conjunction with community participation and input. And in the process, you hope that, working out, doing the job differently changes not only how the job is carried out, but also changes the kinds of people who want to do the job, right? Because Baltimore has actually lost a lot of people, cops. And I think that's a good thing, because the last point I'll say is the places where you've seen huge changes in the state are usually situations in which large numbers of members of the department leave for whatever reason. I'm thinking Chris Magnus's work in Richmond, California. Something like half the department was fired because of a huge corruption scandal. And so you can change, you can change it very quickly. And in saying that, I'm not just saying necessarily that every single person was horrible and bad and needed to leave, but it's just a recognition of path dependence. We all do this, whoever we are, we're used to doing a thing, and it's hard to get people to change, to do something differently. And so one way if you want to make a change, is to make sure that the old people who can't get it together, see, it's early and I'm not being very diplomatic. But anyway, that they move on.
That's well put. I actually have a follow-up question from YouTube on your potato point. And that is, if all you've ever eaten are potatoes, but you're looking for broccolini, who should come up with the idea of broccolini? And if the answer to that is outsiders or the state, isn't that a contradiction to saying that communities know best what they need? No,
because I think what you do is this is an old argument. Think about the work that Weber did on bureaucracies. Experts are experts for a reason, but they may not know what a particular goal should be. So I think that communities are perfectly capable in articulating what they need to feel safe, right? So you ask people, what do you need to feel safe, right? And if you ask them that, as opposed to what kind of bureaucratic service do you want, they'll say police, because that's what they know, right? But if you ask them a more general question about what they need to feel safe, and they say things like, I need clean water, or I need this, or I need to be able to walk home from school without being accosted, then you go to the experts and you say, okay, how do you get the clean water there?
Mm-hmm.
People in the community don't know how to do that, and they shouldn't know how to do that. They're not engineers, but they are experts on telling you what is necessary for their safety. Not complicated.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions coming in. So here's one from L'Oreal. She says, thanks for your insightful keynote, Dr. Meares. In your talk, you mentioned the notion that violence ought to be addressed in terms of a public health approach. In your view, then, does policing have a role in such public health approach? And what might that all be?
Yeah. So to be clear, I offered a public health approach as one way of thinking how to do this. I'm sure there are other ones, but people, once I set out the theoretical framework of this is the thing to do, people naturally say, okay, how do you do it? And so I've offered that as one idea. There are other approaches. I'm actually right now on a National Academy of Sciences panel to reduce racial inequality in the criminal justice system. And, we heard a lot from different organizations doing this work in particular in Indigenous communities. And, they had a particular approach that I wouldn't necessarily call a public health approach, but, I do think that some of those approaches are responsive to the goals of achieving community vitality as I've articulated them. So I don't want to say that it's the only way to do it. I do want to say that we need alternatives to intensely carceral approaches to thinking about public safety. So that was the first thing. I think I lost my train of thought. What was it? Something about, so one was public health, and then what was the second thing?
What the role might be. But I think yeah.
Did I answer it? I feel like I didn't, because I wanted to say one other thing, but I remember. Lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Maybe it'll come back. I will just go to the next. There are lots of questions.
Okay.
Maybe we'll take James because he wants to ask live. So James, if you want to turn your camera on, you can.
Oh, I'm far too ugly for that. You'll have to look at my ugly face later in the day. I was just going to interject because the second part of that question, Sandra, was, okay, we've got a marvelous public health response. How does police?
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. I knew there was a thing I wanted to say.
So that was.
Yeah. Right. So what do they do? So look, I think we have to think about the now and in the future, right? A lot of it depends. I assume the question is saying, how does police fit into this public health model? I would say a slight amendment. How does a policing service as it exists today fit into this public health model? I will give myself a further amendment because I don't know who asked this question or what they're thinking, but another way of asking the question might be, is there any role for armed emergency first responders in this public health model? That might be another way of asking it. And I guess I would say, understanding the situation that we have today, right now, right? I think it is hard for me to imagine a world in which we would simply never have any armed emergency first responder available, right? Given what we have right now. If you have a situation where things are in extremis, an actual shootout or something is happening, and you want an emergency response, in that context, it might be hard to say that you wouldn't have people who are prepared to address that situation in some way. But actually describing that situation emphasizes and I think makes clear the point that having those people around day in and day out to respond to everything doesn't even make sense. Why would you do that? I mean, it would be the same, again, using the emergency room model as saying, like, that is the only medicine that we have available. We don't think that that's true. It's not right. It's not the most healthful response. And, a point that I haven't mentioned yet, it's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly expensive to do that and use that as the state's primary response when they could very well be spending those resources in other more effective and more preventive ways. Again, a point that's been made in public health for a very long time.
You can just jump in.
Okay. Dr. Meares, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I just have a quick question about immigration and attitudes towards policing. I think sociologists such as Todd Hamilton in the last little while have done some research on how immigration is reshaping Black America. And he has shown that certain immigrants from Sub-Sahara and the Caribbean, because they come from a highly selective migration system that basically cherry picks some of the cream of the crop of some of these areas, we have Black immigrants who are coming in with certain advantages over native-born Blacks in terms of higher educational attainment and so on. So I'm wondering how such a shift in the Black in the Black population in America is reflected in attitudes towards policing. Is that something that you have come across at all?
Oh, sorry. And I caught it before somebody said you're muted. Tell me the names of the authors again.
Oh, it's Todd Hamilton. I think he's at Yale.
I heard Hamilton, and who was the second one?
I think Douglas Massey has written something.
Oh,
about
Doug
that.
Massey. Okay,
Yes.
got it. Okay, but not together. They haven't written.
No.
Okay. So, here's what I think of about that. There's lots of variation among ethnic and racial groups sort of everywhere. And, I think you have described one reason for understanding that variation, even among we call in the States, people often call them this descendants of slavery here, which is not to say that people from the Caribbean, of course, are not descendants of slavery that exist elsewhere, but you get the point. In descendants of American slavery, there's also variation in attitudes based on class here, which is why, rather than thinking about these problems in terms of different racial and ethnic groups, I tried for the most part in my talk to focus on neighborhoods and think about analyzing these attitudes geographically. Even then, of course, there's lots of variation, but it's precisely because of work like Doug Massey's that there's so much segregation here, primarily racial, but that kind of segregation always has a class dimension. That I found that to be a way to think about how to address those the problems. And it's interesting that you just mentioned that kind of heterogeneity problem. One thing we know is that I'm thinking about a piece that Moranoff and Sampson did. It's got to be about 20 years ago, maybe even more, in criminology, but basically showing that heterogeneity of attitudes by neighborhood actually predicts legal cynicism, which is related to these concepts of legitimacy and others that I was talking about. So maybe this is even an advantage to the extent that you have heterogeneity in terms of promoting the project. But I haven't thought that idea through, so I'm just tossing that one out there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions. I hope we can fit them in. So one is by Ashley, and she says, thank you so much for your insightful talk. Considering some successful pilot projects, and I think she means Detroit here, but I don't know, where social workers are sent with police officers to mental health calls. Do you feel this is a movement towards potential abolition, or does this extend police presence? My other question is, if you perceive this service as beneficial, how can it be expanded to other states?
Yeah, I mean, I want to resist that framing, and I think I've tried to make clear that there's stuff that we just need to do right now. We just need to, right? People need help right now. They're living in violent contexts, and the police are violent. And my own view, I'm not saying that, that mine is the best, but my own view is that to sort of juxtapose this as if we do this, if we do some of these things to make it better right now, we're necessarily impeding our goal of transformation of the project. I just think that's wrong. I think that there are ways in which it could, so you have to be careful. But the way I try to be careful is to have this, thinking about this project in the context of an overall theoretical approach. My goal is community vitality. Community vitality requires state support of public goods. That perception of conception of public goods has to be wholesome. And, once we get down to the particulars of different things like that, we're just talking about technologies to advance particular goals. I think too many people are focused on that outcome without having an overall conceptual framework that is theoretically driven. So that's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is yeah, I think those things are good ideas. And, and we should have more of them, while we are being very careful that we're not, that's not the be all end all, but the be all end all is not going to be addressed by just thinking about, how many dollars we spend on that thing. I mean, it's going to be addressed by having a serious theoretical approach to the project.
Yeah. Thank you. I like your answer. Okay, very last question, and then we're reaching the end of the session. So this is Dr. Urbanik, and she says, thank you so much for your great keynote address. I'm curious about how you rectify your stance on improving policing, especially in racially and economically subjugated communities, via changing or improving the personnel, with some abolitionists calls that the entire system and not necessarily individual actors are harmful, given its white supremacist roots and manifestations.
Well, I think the answer that I just offered to Ashley is relevant to that, right? So, if I understood the question properly, and I think it's really how you think about time. How do we think about time in the dimension of this project? I am 55 years old. I have been a law professor since I was 26 years old. I've been involved in this project for more years than I have not been involved in this project. And it's going to take a long time, right? So, I think the right way to think about those kinds of questions is to think about it in a context of a theoretical framework that has a particular goal. And just like, the strategy that Ashley mentioned is like one aspect of that thing. So too is thinking about, how do we think about changing the people who are there right now in a world in which that's not going away today, probably shouldn't go away today. And, by changing certain kinds of personnel, you can also engage in the project of changing their job so that you have, for example, fewer armed people and stuff like that. I personally don't see that as an inconsistency, but, I understand the ways in which, because I've been doing this for so long, I'm really in the weeds, and I understand a lot about how these bureaucracies operate internally in a way that people who aren't as close to them don't always see.
Hey, thank you so much. And I know that many of my colleagues, as they're putting in comments on the YouTube channel, are all nodding along to your point that some things need to be done right now. So that's, I think we all share common ground on that. Thank you so much for your insightful keynote. We have more questions, but we're running out of time. So thank you so much. And before we're logging off live, I just want to announce the next speakers. We will have at 9:40 Mountain Time. So there will be a 25-minute break or 20-minute break. At 9:40 a.m. Mountain Time, we'll have Brittany Fox Williams from Lehman College and Kanika Samuels from Carleton University here in Canada, and then Scott Wortley and Akwasi Owusu-Bempah from the University of Toronto. So that will be our next panel at 9:40, and we hope to see many of you back then. And Tracy, thank you so much for your keynote. I know we've all enjoyed it, and we will hopefully see everyone back at 9:40. Thank you.
Bye.